The official narratives present the U.S.-Mexico border as a zone of complexity, a site where two nations grapple with intractable issues: migration, narcotics, economic disparity. This framing, however, functions as a narrative firewall, obscuring a more fundamental truth. The events unfolding along this 1,954-mile stretch are not merely complex, they are symptomatic of a calculated system, a testing ground for power structures designed to precede a deep geopolitical shift. When we observe the consistent escalation of specific problems, unabated migration flows, the persistent resilience of organized crime, and the seemingly endless debate over border security, we must ask, is this a failure of policy or a feature of its design? Public discourse attributes the surge in migration to push factors like poverty and violence in Central America, compounded by pull factors of economic opportunity in the U.S. Yet, applying basic data-driven skepticism, a different picture emerges. Consider the consistency of the migration waves following periods of specific economic or security policy shifts in Latin America, some directly influenced by external actors. If certain policies predictably lead to displacement, the continued implementation of such policies warrants scrutiny. Is this an instance of repeated strategic miscalculation or a deliberate modulation of human flow? Similarly, the narrative of the all-powerful elusive cartel defies a logical analysis of logistics. One must ask, how can multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprises operate at this scale, across international borders, consistently circumventing state apparatuses, without access to high-level intelligence, advanced weaponry, and financial infrastructure that bypasses conventional scrutiny? If anti-narcotics operations consistently fail to dismantle leadership or key logistical networks, the question shifts from why are they so powerful to who benefits from their continued controlled existence. The data on weapons flows, for instance, often points to publicly available supply chains that, through various intermediaries, equip these groups. A simple cross-reference of interdicted weapon serial numbers with open-source arms databases often reveals a consistent pattern that challenges the narrative of independent illicit networks. The Black Swan scenario, often discussed in contingency planning, a collapse of order in a significant Mexican region, is presented as an unforeseen risk. However, when we apply the principle of Socratic inquiry, filtering through the data of steadily weakened institutions, rising cartel influence, and escalating border incidents, this unforeseen risk appears less like a random event and more like a logical conclusion of current trajectories. Could this be a pre-programmed outcome, a golden scenario designed to justify deeper intervention and a comprehensive remapping of regional power? The U.S.-Mexico border, in this light, ceases to be a mere line on a map. It becomes a potential battlefield, an operational theater where the interests of larger, unseen players converge. The upcoming national elections in both Mexico and the United States are often framed as democratic processes to determine policy direction. Yet, a more systemic view reveals them as mechanisms to select nodes or actors within a pre-existing network, each tasked with executing specific elements of an overarching long-term agenda. The North American Free Trade Agreement, now the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, was publicly presented as a mechanism for economic integration and shared prosperity. When we examine the detailed compliance reports and the specific dispute resolution clauses, certain patterns emerge. For instance, the USMCA's enforcement mechanisms, particularly concerning labor and environmental standards, have led to targeted disputes. These disputes, while seemingly organic, can function as leverage points, creating economic pressure that further integrates Mexico as a dependent factory for multinational corporations. The question is not whether USMCA benefits trade, but for whom, and whether certain secret clauses embedded deep within the appendices of the agreement create pathways for control beyond mere commerce. The consistent, substantial flow of migrants from Central America and Mexico is not simply a spontaneous human response to adversity.
It is also the predictable consequence of strategies employed to destabilize specific regions. When economic aid packages are tied to structural adjustments that dismantle local agricultural sectors, for example, the resulting displacement of populations is an expected outcome, not an accident. This human flow then functions as a systemic pressure, creating social and political stress points within the destination countries. Is this a crisis or a controlled demolition of existing social structures, a form of demographic restructuring to serve a larger, unstated design? The rise of the cartels, particularly their consolidation of power and expansion of influence, coincides too neatly with the erosion of local and state governance in Mexico. These groups do not merely traffic illicit goods. They actively undermine state authority, functioning as an internal enemy that justifies increased security expenditures and the potential for external intervention. The persistent failures of major anti-drug campaigns, often reported with an air of inevitability, can, when analyzed through a systemic lens, be reinterpreted as a selective enforcement, allowing certain cartel factions to thrive while others are eliminated, ensuring a perpetual state of controlled chaos. Who supplies these groups with the advanced communication intercepts and high-grade weaponry that often outmatch local law enforcement, allowing them to consistently stay one step ahead, as public reports frequently state? The official declarations regarding border challenges and the legislative responses, new border security bills, international aid packages, trade dispute resolutions, often serve as foreground narratives. When we place these against the backdrop of raw data, electoral outcomes invariably leading to predictable policy shifts, security cooperation agreements selectively targeting specific groups while others expand, and increased cartel violence serving as a consistent signal, the congruence is unsettling. It suggests that these reported inputs are not random variables, but part of an ongoing, programmed sequence intended to guide events toward a predetermined conclusion. The United States government, often cast publicly as the gatekeeper defending its borders, also functions as a primary node in this larger network. Its stated goals of reducing illegal migration and curbing drug flows are widely accepted. However, when we examine the actual operational outcomes, persistent migration, the continued flow of illicit narcotics, and the escalating militarization of the border, the question arises: are these operations designed to succeed in their stated objectives, or do they serve deeper, unstated interests, perhaps even functioning to divert internal political pressure through a manufactured external crisis? The substantial expenditure on border security projects, often awarded to corporations with deep ties to political figures, indicates a financial subsystem actively benefiting from the continuation of the problem. The persistent congressional division, for example, acts like a pressure valve, dissipating public frustration, while the underlying system continues its trajectory unimpeded by genuine transformative policy. Conversely, the Mexican government, often portrayed as a victim caught between the pressures of its northern neighbor and internal criminal elements, also participates in this intricate system. While national sovereignty is a frequently invoked principle, the operational realities sometimes suggest a different function. Data on Mexico's internal migratory policies, when cross-referenced with externally driven demands, often reveal discrepancies. For instance, an analysis of the official immigration policies of Mexico compared to observed migration patterns, particularly the channeling of specific migrant groups through certain regions, raises the question of deliberate facilitation rather than mere control. The perceived weakness of Mexican governmental institutions, far from being an accidental failing, can be seen as a systemic condition, potentially a result of deliberate erosion either from within or through external pressures. This state functions as justification for the expansion of foreign military cooperation agreements and security assistance, effectively creating a framework for external presence under the guise of stabilization.
The cartels themselves, the shadow army of this system, embody its most brutal functionality. They are not merely profit-driven entities. Their violent actions, their control over vast swaths of territory, and their consistent ability to recover from major enforcement actions indicate a more profound purpose: to maintain a state of controlled chaos. The data on their sophisticated logistical capabilities, often mirroring those of state actors, and their access to real-time intelligence suggests a relationship of more than mere opposition to state power. They appear to be programmed nodes, serving to destabilize, to create gray zones of lawlessness that can later be re-engineered rather than simply eradicated. The consistent failure of major cartel leaders to be apprehended without warning, for example, often points to a carefully managed system of operations and counter-operations. Beyond the visible actors, certain elements of the U.S.-Mexican business community are not passive observers. An examination of foreign direct investment, FDI, into Mexico, particularly in strategic sectors like energy and high-tech manufacturing, reveals patterns that do not always align with organic market forces. These investments often coincide with periods of increased political or social instability, allowing for the acquisition of assets at deflated prices. Similarly, the growing industry of border security, often involving private military contractors and surveillance technology firms, represents a lucrative ecosystem directly benefiting from the perpetuation of the border crisis. The ultimate beneficiaries are not always declared, often hidden within complex corporate structures and anonymous shareholder agreements. The geopolitical dimension of this system cannot be overstated. International alliances and organizations such as the UN or OAS, while appearing to uphold international norms, can, in practice, be neutralized or co-opted. Their existing frameworks can even be used as tools to legitimize actions taken under the guise of humanitarian intervention or security assistance. The upcoming elections in both countries, therefore, become less about the democratic will of the people and more about selecting the most effective characters to advance a pre-scripted plan. Diplomatic isolation, often threatened against Mexico, functions as a powerful lever to ensure compliance, providing a public justification for the imposition of sanctions or more direct forms of intervention. Economically, the USMCA, far from being an immutable agreement, is subject to strategic manipulation. The threat or actual imposition of tariffs or the strategic suspension of certain clauses can be used to generate economic shockwaves, compelling Mexico to accept more stringent terms or to open up specific sectors to foreign investment. When we track the global energy markets, particularly the fluctuations in oil and gas prices coinciding with political rhetoric surrounding Mexico's energy policy, the question of deliberate market manipulation for specific gains arises. Even remittances, often lauded as a crucial economic lifeline, can, when analyzed through the lens of data, be seen as a form of conditional aid, exerting subtle control over local economies, tying them inexorably to the economic directives of the sending country. Militarily, the ongoing instability along the border provides a compelling rationale for the increased militarization of the region. This is not simply about border patrol agents. The data on joint military exercises, the sharing of intelligence, and the deployment of advanced surveillance technology point to a pattern of escalating military presence. The potential for a large-scale border incident, an event that could be orchestrated or exploited, would offer the perfect casus belli for more direct, wide-scale military intervention under the guise of stabilizing the region. This increased security presence concurrently facilitates the expansion of mass surveillance programs and the proliferation of private military and security companies, effectively transforming the border into a live laboratory for control technologies. The scenario of complex and volatile cooperation, frequently presented in official reports, is the public-facing narrative. It describes an ongoing, seemingly intractable process of negotiations, minor agreements, and persistent problems. This surface play maintains a public perception of control and ongoing efforts, preventing widespread alarm. However, its true function is to sustain a state of controlled chaos, preparing the ground for more significant, irreversible shifts without triggering overwhelming public resistance. It slowly erodes the institutions and resources of both nations, making them more pliable for future reconfigurations. The escalating tensions and crisis scenario, far from being an accidental deviation, appears to be a deliberately engineered phase. Data analysis shows that this escalation is often the direct product of policies designed for failure. For example, when immigration policies are constructed with known loopholes or insufficient resources, the resulting crisis of overwhelming numbers becomes a predictable outcome. A staged miscalculation or a strategically amplified border incident, such as a major, high-casualty cartel attack near the border, could be the precise trigger needed to justify extreme actions, unilateral sanctions, the suspension of USMCA, or even limited military incursions. This path leads to severe instability in Mexico, potentially precipitating institutional collapse in vulnerable regions. For the U.S., it creates a major internal crisis that can be leveraged to justify the implementation of more authoritarian national security programs, further solidifying control and reshaping the internal political landscape. Ultimately, the black swan scenario, the wide-scale collapse of order in a strategic Mexican state, is not a random, unpredictable anomaly. It is, by all indications, the intended ultimate goal. When we connect the individual data points, the systematic weakening of governance, the deliberate fostering of cartel power, the strategic deployment of migratory pressures, and the increasing calls for intervention, this scenario reveals itself as a predetermined endpoint. The resulting humanitarian crisis would be so vast, so overwhelming, that it would demand a military reaction and international intervention, likely led by the United States. This stabilization would, in effect, establish new forms of control, perhaps leading to special economic zones or security mandates administered by external powers. The uncontrolled waves of migration resulting from such an event would not be simply a consequence. They would be a profound opportunity for a deliberate demographic restructuring of the region, fundamentally altering social and political structures for generations. This border, therefore, is not merely a line. It is the crucible where elements of a larger, global Great Reset are being tested and implemented. To verify this, observe the following indicators. 1. The intensity and scope of U.S. militarization along the border, particularly the increase in joint military exercises with Mexico and the deployment of advanced military hardware. 2. Any sudden, significant escalation of border incidents, especially those involving civilian casualties, and how these events are amplified and framed by official media outlets. 3. The increasing prevalence of aggressive rhetoric from high-level politicians advocating for military solutions or interventions based on arguments of national security or sovereignty. 4. The accelerated acquisition of land, infrastructure, or strategic industries in Mexican border regions by international corporations or investment funds. 5. documented instances of local government institutions in specific strategically important Mexican states effectively ceding control or showing systematic collapse of the rule of law. Do not accept the prepared narratives. Seek out the raw data, cross-reference official statements with observable outcomes, and through this process of analysis, arrive at your own conclusions. This is the only path to awareness and the only defense against a future that is being ruthlessly shaped right before our eyes.
They are constructing a new operational reality, and the US-Mexico border is the blueprint's initial point of execution.